Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Once they were the closest of political allies, but today Dominic Cummings has delivered the harshest of criticisms against his old boss, Boris Johnson. In a withering 7-hour session in front of a Commons committee, Mr Cummings, who left Downing Street last November, said thousands of people have lost their lives in the pandemic because of the failure of leadership in government. He admitted making mistakes himself, but didn't spare those around him. Dominic Cummings described Boris Johnson as unfit to lead the country. As for Matt Hancock, he accused the Health Secretary of lying and said he should have been fired. And he described failures right from the start of the pandemic, saying there was no lockdown plan. Our first report is from our political editor Laura Koonsberg on revelations that give us a glimpse into the heart of government during the pandemic.
Reality or revenge? Delving back into troubled recent history. Dominic Cummings' day to give his version of events. A verdict of failure. And an apology for his part.
Senior ministers, senior officials, senior advisors like me fell disastrously short of the standards that the public has a right to expect. When the public needed us most, the government failed. And I'd like to say to all the families of those who died unnecessarily, how sorry I am for the mistakes that were made and for my own mistakes at that.
The government's public position had been it was well prepared. But he revealed how in the second week of March last year, senior officials suddenly realised that just wasn't the case.
Telemac Morris said, I've come through here to the Prime Minister's office to tell you all, quote, I think we are absolutely I think this country is heading for a disaster. I think we're going to kill thousands of people.
He described the original expectation, a peak in early summer, protecting the most vulnerable. But as flaws in the numbers emerged, how rapidly plans were sketched out on whiteboards to accelerate to lockdown, showing if nothing changed, the NHS would collapse, and the poignant line, who do we not save? And why did it take him so long to ask the Prime Minister to change his mind?
Do you not recognise that that was a massive failure on your part as his chief advisor, that you took so long to come to him with advice to change tack?
Yes, it was a huge failing of mine, and I bitterly regret that I didn't kind of hit the emergency panic button earlier than I did. But I was incredibly frightened, I guess is the word, about the consequences of me kind of pulling a massive emergency string and saying the official plan is wrong and it's going to kill everyone and you've got to change path, because what if I'm wrong?
Number 10 sounded sometimes in chaos. On one particular day, grappling with the possibility of lockdown, potential strikes in Iraq, and the number 10 dog.
So we had this sort of completely insane situation in which part of the building was saying, are we going to bomb Iraq? Part of the building was arguing about whether or not we're going to do quarantine or not do quarantine. The Prime Minister has his girlfriend going crackers about something completely trivial.
And a Prime Minister unwilling to take the disease seriously.
In February, the Prime Minister regarded this as just a scare story. If we have the Prime Minister chairing Cobra meetings and he just tells everyone it's swine flu, don't worry about it, I'm going to get Chris Whitty to inject me live on TV with coronavirus so everyone realises it's nothing to be frightened of, that would not help actually serious planning.
Only halfway through,
I will first call the Prime Minister to answer the engagement.
The Prime Minister had to defend the claims next door.
This morning, the Prime Minister's former closest advisor said, when the public needed us most, the government failed. Does the Prime Minister agree with that?
The handling of this pandemic has been one of the most difficult things this country has had to do for a very long time. And none of the decisions have been easy. To go into a lockdown is a traumatic thing for a country.
Mr Cummings' real vitriol was saved, though, for the Health Secretary, who may not just be able to run away from a long list of accusations.
I think that the Secretary of State for Health should have been fired for at least 15, 20 things, including...
And putting people in care homes in danger.
The government rhetoric was, we put a shield around care homes and blah, blah, blah. It was complete nonsense. Quite the opposite of putting a shield around them. We sent people with COVID back to the care homes.
The Health Secretary's teams rejected his claims. But then there were accusations that the Prime Minister wouldn't listen to Mr Cummings or the top scientists to bring back lockdown to save lives in the autumn.
Whose advice was he taking?
He wasn't taking any advice, he was just making his own decision that he was going to ignore the advice.
Did you hear him say, let the bodies pile high in their thousands?
I heard that in the Prime Minister's study.
Then a direct blast at the man he helped put in Downing Street.
Fundamentally, I regarded him as unfit for the job, and I was trying to create a structure around him to try and stop what I thought were extremely bad decisions.
But after hours, for those who lost family, for those who've suffered, perhaps this most important verdict.
Tens of thousands of people died who didn't need to die.
For the first time, someone who was involved in making the decisions during this crisis has come to that conclusion in public. A claim the government's always disputed or tried to ignore, but one day will have to answer in full. Laura Kunzberg, BBC News, Westminster.
In an epic session to MPs in the Palace of Westminster behind me, the Prime Minister's former chief advisor, Dominic Cummings, turned on his former boss, accusing him of not being fit to run the country. He compared Boris Johnson to a broken shopping trolley and claimed chaos in the government's COVID decision-making resulted in tens of thousands of people dying who didn't need to. Herd immunity, in which hundreds of thousands more would have died, had been the policy until he made them changes. Mr Cummings painted a picture of an imploding government, lacking data and following bad scientific advice. And he went on to accuse the Health Secretary of lying repeatedly about PPE, medical treatment and the supposed shield around care homes. Here's our political editor, Gary Gibbon. His report starts with flash photography.
It's a partnership that convulsed our politics on Brexit and then regrouped in office, now shattered. Dominic Cummings today said the man he served in number 10 for 16 months was unfit for the highest office.
Fundamentally, I regarded him as unfit for the job, and I was trying to create a structure around him to try and stop what I thought were extremely bad decisions and push other things through against his wishes. Nobody could find a way around the problem of the Prime Minister just like a shopping trolley smashing from one side of the aisle into the other. For him, he just gets up, reads the papers, says, right, what are they doing today? And then cannons around. There's a very profound question about the nature of our political system that means that we got at the last election a choice between Jeremy Corbyn and Boris Johnson. I think any system which ends up giving a choice between two people like that as the people to lead is obviously a system that's gone extremely badly wrong.
Dominic Cummings was giving MPs his inside view of Downing Street during the COVID crisis. 6 months after he walked out of number 10, he started his account at the beginning of last year, the wasted weeks of the COVID crisis.
Number 10 was not operating on a war footing in February on this in any way, shape or form. Lots of key people were literally skiing in the middle of February.
Boris Johnson found other things to do when the first 5 Cobra meetings on COVID happened. But Dominic Cummings said Boris Johnson wouldn't have been greatly missed.
The view of various officials inside number 10 was if we have the Prime Minister chairing Cobra meetings and he just tells everyone it's swine flu, don't worry about it, I'm going to get Chris Whitty to inject me live on TV with coronavirus so everyone realises it's nothing to be frightened of, that would not help.
Our country remains extremely well prepared.
While the government was telling the population it had a long prepared plan, Dominic Cummings said by mid-March, when he thought lockdown was needed, there was no plan to be found.
We said to the Prime Minister, you are going to have to lock down, but there is no lockdown plan. It doesn't exist. SAGE haven't modelled it, DH don't have a plan. This is like a scene from Independence Day with Jeff Goldblum saying the aliens are here and your whole plan is broken and you need a new plan, right? That is what the scene was like that morning.
The clock is ticking.
For Dominic Cummings, one of the biggest villains of the COVID crisis was the Health Secretary. Matt Hancock, he said, frustrated test and trace development with his own targets.
I am now setting the goal of 100,000 tests per day by the end of this month.
Dominic Cummings said he should have been sacked long ago.
In April, we had this terrible pledge which was hugely distorting the whole system. We also had constant repeated lying about PPE. The Cabinet Secretary said to the Prime Minister in almost the first meeting when he came back, Prime Minister, the British system is not set up to deal with a Secretary of State who repeatedly lies in meetings.
As Dominic Cummings' sprawling 7-hour evidence session carried on at one end of Parliament, at Prime Minister's questions, Boris Johnson had to deal with the ammunition his former aide had given the opposition.
Did the Cabinet Secretary advise him, the Prime Minister, that he, the Cabinet Secretary, had, quote, lost faith in the Health Secretary's honesty?
The answer to that is no, Mr. Speaker, and I'm afraid I haven't had the benefit of seeing the evidence that he's bringing to the House.
Back down the corridor, Dominic Cummings hadn't finished attacking Matt Hancock's test targets.
Hancock wanted to be able to go on TV and say, look at me, my 100k target. It was criminal, disgraceful behaviour that caused serious harm.
He said the Health Secretary misled colleagues about testing patients before they moved to care homes, and the government then misled the nation.
Now, all the government rhetoric was, we put a shield around care homes and blah, blah, blah. It was complete nonsense. Quite the opposite of putting a shield around them. We sent people with COVID back to the care homes.
Thank you. That's extraordinary.
Mr. Speaker, I don't think anybody could credibly accuse this government of being complacent about the threat that this virus posed.
But as his words echoed, that's exactly what his former aide was accusing him of. Dominic Cummings said the Prime Minister fiercely opposed a second lockdown and bitterly regretted the first one.
There's a great misunderstanding people have that because it nearly killed him, therefore he must have taken it seriously. But in fact, after the first lockdown, his view was he was cross with me and for others into what he regarded as basically pushing him into the first lockdown. His argument after that happened was, literally, quote, I should have been the mayor of Jaws and kept the beaches open. That's what he said on many, many occasions.
We have to close the beaches.
Number 10 will be hoping that Dominic Cummings is still so hurt by his own image problems and his notorious lockdown trip to Barnard Castle that his words carry little weight. Mr. Cummings said the trip north was prompted by serious threats to him and his family, which he'd not been able to talk about when he originally defended the trip.
I made just a terrible, terrible, terrible mistake, which I'm extremely sorry about. What I should have done, in retrospect, is I should have called my wife and said, listen, you and our boy are going to have to get out of London again. I'm going to have to just explain the truth about this whole thing.
Sack Cummings!
He admitted what he'd denied at the time, that his actions had undermined government lockdown messaging. And he accepted his responsibility for wider government policy failures, which he said had caused thousands of preventable deaths.
When the public needed us most, the government failed. And I'd like to say to all the families of those who died unnecessarily, how sorry I am for the mistakes that were made and for my own mistakes at that.
He'd trashed the reputation of a man he helped to propel into number 10. He portrayed Boris Johnson as glib, unworthy of his office, at the mercy of newspapers and vocal Tory MPs, and a fiancée who weighed in unconstitutionally on government jobs and distracted the Prime Minister at critical moments with petty matters. He said it would be better for everyone if he himself now disappeared from the public scene. Downing Street would love nothing more.
Well, Gary Gibbon is with me and our health and social care editor, Victoria MacDonald. What do you think?
It was an extraordinary portrait of, as Dominic Cummings would like to present it, a dysfunctional government with a dysfunctional Prime Minister, a government that lies to you, he would did argue repeatedly, a government that's the victim of groupthink, something you'd have thought someone like Dominic Cummings is meant to come in and puncture, a government that for a substantial period at the beginning of the COVID crisis doesn't really use some of the data that's around. Again, something you'd expect Dominic Cummings to be across. I think number 10 will be glad that there wasn't what they had been fearing, some sort of document dump. Dominic Cummings did come along with a couple of bits of paper that he waved. The House of Commons cameras coyly went behind him just in case it was stuff that he shouldn't be in possession of, but it wasn't that interesting. Will it shift perceptions of the government? A lot of voters, we can see this in polling, you hear it anecdotally when you're out and about, actually give Boris Johnson the benefit of the doubt on this. They say, actually, you've been running the country in a crisis which nobody would have had the answers to. And I think there's also a sense that an awful lot of voters, in the same way that they kind of wanted to move on from Brexit, want to move on from COVID. They may not be up for an in-depth sort of post-mortem on the whole thing. And as for Dominic Cummings, well, maybe he's not the best person to convert people anyway, and he was a bit late showing his humility, some people might feel.
Victoria, I mean, suddenly lots of things made sense. I mean, you couldn't help wondering if Dominic Cummings had watched your coverage a little bit more closely at the beginning. He might not have been in this mess.
Very kind of you, Krishnan. Yes, I'm sure he was glued to Channel 4 News. Well, he should have been. Many of us, not just Channel 4 News, were asking questions about test and trace, about the shielding, about the ventilators, about the care homes, and we were getting constant pushback on it. You know, I've never had so many angry phone calls from various officials saying you're talking nonsense. And yet what we heard today all did begin to make sense. There was this feeling, and you didn't want to believe it, that there was chaos going on both in Downing Street and in the Department of Health, that they weren't always talking to each other, that they didn't actually seem to have a plan. And you know what jarred? We were talking to the people at the front line. We were talking to the doctors, the nurses, the residents in the care homes, the relatives. They were telling us that there was a shortage of PPE. They were telling us that they weren't being tested, and yet we were constantly told we were talking rubbish. Then, the pandemic preparedness, this is the one that really jars. We did a big investigation to show that half the stock in the stockpile was out of date. Now, I've got this response is still up on the Department of Health website. They say this is an unprecedented pandemic and we have taken the right steps at the right time to combat it, guided at all times by the best scientific advice. Well, that's not quite what Dominic Cummings said today. He talked about shielding, saying there wasn't even a helpline ready to go at the time. And then there was the 100,000 a day testing pledge from Matt Hancock. Now, I remember very specifically when he made that pledge, because I thought, well, great, we need more testing, nobody disputes that, but they actually at that time only had capacity for 40,000, and even then people weren't taking it up. Well, Mr. Cummings said that it was a stupid plan and that it was so that Mr. Hancock could go on television and look great. Now, of course, this is all denied, but there is just that feeling that really it was not going to plan at all when it should have been, when lives were at stake.
Thank you. Well, of course, we did want to talk to the government, but no one was available. In fact, Matt Hancock testing back to say he wasn't rising to this and he's got more important things to do. But joining me now is the Conservative MP and chair of the Defence Select Committee, Tobias Ellwood. Mr. Ellwood, Dominic Cummings said he heard Boris Johnson saying that he'd rather the bodies piled up than have another lockdown, something the Prime Minister has explicitly denied. Do you believe Dominic Cummings or Boris Johnson?
No, I don't think that's the right question to ask, but I understand why you want to.
I'm asking, actually. So just answer it.
Well, I will answer it my way, but all I'm trying to explain is that this was very illuminating, it was very candid. In parts, it was constructive, but we need to divide the score settling from the wider evidence which we can absolutely learn from. And, to make it clear, whether you're in a boardroom or a military ops room, or indeed at the heart of government at number 10, or indeed the White House, you will hear and participate in frank discussions that are held in private. And even the Prime Minister is allowed to be asked questions, and whether they be awkward or naive, without fear that they may come back to be quoted or misquoted, because that will diminish the competence of number 10. So you asking me these questions today, whether I'm going to, give credit to or indeed have an opinion on what one side of the argument is saying or not, absolutely, we can learn from part of what Dominic Cummings is saying. I agree that we were late in coming to the party, getting PPE in place. I agree that.
All right, hang on. No, hang on. Let me ask the questions.
The speed of this
Let me
pandemic.
ask the questions, Dominic. Tobias Ellwood, I'll ask you the questions. It's the better way to do an interview. If it's true that Matt Hancock told the Prime Minister that people would not be returned to care homes without being tested, that's disastrous, isn't it? He's got to resign.
You're asking me to comment on somebody who's at the heart of government, the most powerful person other than the Prime Minister, and it's not my place to do so. My two takeaways, if I can give this interview some structure, is firstly to make it very, very clear that we did fail in appreciating the pace in which this pandemic was going to rip through right across the world, not just in the UK. We modelled everything on SARS. That transmission where it started in China.
I'm
we had less
grateful
than a
to you for
dozen
coming
cases
on,
here.
but it's not your job to try and structure this interview, it's mine. I'm asking you really simple questions about who you believe. Now, are you saying you don't believe Dominic Cummings? Because if that's the implication, then just say it.
It's not. I'm not going to give any form of justification to Dominic Cummings' evidence today, which is all about score settling. I will rise and recognise and agree with him that we relied on an existing cabinet construct, which has been tried and tested, but is risk averse and siloed. And cabinet members were, well-intentioned, but mostly ill-equipped and inexperienced to deal with this pandemic to scale. We needed to have better strategic oversight, swifter decision-making, better command and control. But Dominic Cummings was absolutely in the position to change that, and it didn't.
Right, well, what about the specific allegations against Matt Hancock, which are that he didn't throw a protective ring around care homes, that he didn't get test and trace running, and that he had lied about these things, that he'd lied specifically about people getting all the care and treatment that they needed and deserved when he had been told, Dominic Cummings said, by the chief medical officers that that wasn't possible. Now, the question is, if these things are true, how can Matt Hancock remain as health secretary?
Well, I hope you would have got the hint already that I'm not going to rise to that. I'm not going to, stoop to that level to make comments on one side of the argument. What I will say is that Matt Hancock is one of those hardest working cabinet members, but the structure that we continue to have was somebody who had a massive, big chunky Whitehall department, also oversight of the hospitals, care homes, as you mentioned, PPE, track and trace, as well as the vaccine rollout as well. And that is simply too much for one department to actually function on. We should have actually developed a capability with experts being brought in and adapt in more like a warlike footing to be able to deal with swifter decision-making, command and control, and communication. That didn't happen. We eventually got it right, thankfully, with the vaccine rollout, with that task force, thanks to Kate Bingham and Nadeem Sahawi. And that has saved lives.
Tobias Elwood, thank you very much for joining us. Well, our political editor, Gary Gibbon, and health and social care editor, Victoria MacDonald, are still with me. Gary Gibbon, how does this leave Matt Hancock?
Well, it's uncomfortable. He's got to appear at a press conference tomorrow. But do bear in mind, those press conferences were not devised as moments of incredible scrutiny. They were devised in the format was made up for a different purpose. So I don't expect him to come under enormous pressure then. In the end, your career around the cabinet table usually ends because the Prime Minister's wants you shifted. Well, he might want Matt Hancock moved to another job, but he's not going to do it right now, as Dominic Cummings has asked for it in public and revealed that he was asking for it repeatedly in private. So even though he may well get shifted at some point, it's not going to happen immediately. And the other thing that can sometimes push you over the edge out of a job is pressure from MPs. And there are quite a lot of Tory MPs who find Matt Hancock a little grating, but most of them have a special place in hell for Dominic Cummings. So I don't think he's under immediate pressure.
Victoria, we are by the memorial wall. What do you think the families affected by this are making of this?
Well, I think what you forget in amongst the politics of today is actually the number of people who have been affected by this, the bereaved families, those who've died, the health and care workers who are burnt out. All of that wasn't really part of the discussion today, but it is very much on the minds of the bereaved families, and they have long been calling for an inquiry. They still want an inquiry. Now, I spoke to Lobby Akinola earlier, and his father, Olufemi, was 60. He died last April. He was a care worker. He had to improvise his own PPE. And I put to Lobby, what did he think about that accusation that Dominic Cummings made, that the Prime Minister thought last February that COVID was just a scare story?
It's evidence of a level of hubris that I think I and many people suspect the Prime Minister has, and that has informed his decision making, not just throughout this entire pandemic. I don't understand how you can look out into the world. We saw China and Wuhan locking down. We saw WHO being like, this is a crisis. And for the Prime Minister to say it's a scare tactic, and I think that's just been at the core of the government's response to the pandemic. Has always seemed to be, how do we look versus how well are we doing?
I sort of get the impression that you're struggling almost to convey exactly how you're feeling today after hearing that.
It is difficult to articulate. There's a lot of emotions mixed in. There's some vindication that, like I said, I mean, I'm part of a group that's been calling for an increase since June last year, because we were like, this can't be right. The way the government's handling this pandemic can't be correct. And, you know, we were pushed aside, ignored, and lo and behold, our suspicions were correct. So there's that kind of vindication, but there's the anger that the government didn't learn. They didn't learn. They chose not to learn. Like, after the first wave, why did we have the record numbers of death in the second wave? Why was there not that learning? And I think all of these emotions get brought up, you know, and also are shrouded in the fact that all of this is happening in effectively a theatre show, like a pantomime. You know, it's Cummings said this, Johnson did that, Hancock, and it's just feeling like there's no regard for the people who have been affected by this pandemic. Dominic Cummings' testimony had references to Independence Day, like and Spider-Man, and it's like 100,000 people have died. I don't think it's the place or the time for, you know, that kind of somewhat irreverent speech.
So as you said, you have been calling for a long time now for an inquiry. Do you think there is now the urgency, now that we perhaps have had some of the answers?
Yeah, I think if anything, it shows how urgent the inquiry's always been. And I mean, Dominic Cummings himself said that there's no reason to wait. There's no reason to hold back for this inquiry. And he said he suspects that it's, you know, a political maneuver on the government's part to wait for the election.
Do you think that your father's life could have been saved? Do you think he needed to have died?
I personally don't think my dad had to die. I know that when there's a pandemic like this, when illness spreads to the country, of course people are going to die, and that's a sad truth, but not in the scale. It didn't have to be at this scale. And when I think about my dad, you know, he was a healthy man. He was 60, he's not like particularly elderly. He was active and fit. And unfortunately for us, you know, my family was full of frontline workers. My brothers worked in supermarkets, my mum was a pharmacist, my dad was working in care. It's difficult to think that had he been given the support he needed, had he been given the PPE, you know, had there been that consideration for the people who were keeping us going throughout this pandemic, that he'd have been fine. And no, I don't think my dad had to die. And unfortunately, that's something I have to carry forever now.
As for the official figures, the latest government data shows that 9 more people have died with COVID, bringing the total deaths to 127,748, while the number of new positive cases has gone over 3,000 for the first time since the 1st of April. Over 38,370,000 people have had a first dose of vaccine, almost 73% of the adult population, and over 23,600,000 have had 2 doses. That's over 44% of UK adults. Anyone aged 30 and 31 can now book their first jabs. Well, I'm joined now by the Professor of Global Public Health at Edinburgh University, Devi Sridhar, who's also an advisor to the Scottish Government, and Richard Horton, editor of the medical journal The Lancet. Richard Horton, how did it feel watching today?
Well, I was actually incredibly grateful to Dominic Cummings, because during those early months of the pandemic, I had people in touch with me on the front lines of healthcare, nurses and doctors fighting this pandemic, who were saying there was no PPE, there was no treatment, there was no plan, no preparedness at all. And the government consistently denied that, saying that there was a plan, that everything was under control and in order. And actually what Dominic Cummings today revealed was that indeed there was no preparedness at all. And I think that's important. It corroborates the evidence that was given to us through March, April and May of last year. It's very important to validate that experience.
Devi Sridhar, I mean, it also confirm that the scientific advice the government was getting at the beginning of the pandemic was totally inappropriate?
Well, I think SAGE at the time operated like a black box, and they were seeing this as an uncontrollable infection, and so in a way presented the government an easy solution, which is basically do nothing. And there was a real lack of looking at other parts of the world, East Asia. You know, as editor of The Lancet, Richard published articles about what was happening in China. We had Taiwan. There were many parts of the world where there were lessons, but they were just completely overlooked in our response here.
So what are your big takeaways from today's evidence? What do you think we've learned?
Well, I think we've learned that first, we need humility in the face of an infectious disease. We finally saw honesty and acknowledgement from the government of the mistakes made. We now have recognition of that it was largely preventable, both the health and economic crisis, if we had managed to follow other parts of the world. And that actually this idea that we had to save the economy and sacrifice lives was just wrong. There was never a trade-off between health aims and economic aims. If you wanted to keep the economy open, you had to figure out how to suppress. And to do that, you required very early on to build up your testing system and your tracing system, support isolation. You had to have border measures in place so you didn't have a constant stream of infection in. And you needed to let people know about things like face coverings, you know, how the virus transmitted, so everyone in their daily lives could make those shifts. Other places avoided the kind of lockdowns we've seen over the past year, as well as the tens of thousands of lives lost, by following, you know, basic public health guidance, which took us a long time to get to.
Richard Horton, I mean, as he described, you know, this sort of struggle, the most powerful advisor not being listened, you know, he seemed to be saying, yes, lockdown early, follow what the Taiwanese and South Koreans are doing. All the things that people like Devi Sridhar and you were on Channel 4 News every night saying, and no one was listening. I mean, was that plausible in terms of the way government works?
Well, I think what you saw, and he talked about this, the multiple responsibilities that different parts of the system had, that nobody took single command and control responsibility. He talked about it would have been best if there was a dictator running this whole operation. Perhaps not a dictator, but what you had was you had multiple government committees, SAGE, SPI-M, SPI-B, NERV-TAG, the CMO's office, the CSA's office, all taking a role, but nobody taking a single responsibility. And that was the problem. All this data was coming in from China, from northern Italy, but nobody was able to channel that into a simple decision-making process at the heart of government. And you had a Prime Minister who thought this was a scare story and just swine flu anyway.
Devi Sridhar, some people might say, well, look, you know, you didn't have Cummings in Scotland, yet you've had a very similar epidemic there, very similar scale of problems, and you know the curves have followed the same shape. So maybe it wasn't that kind of chaos that caused what happened in England, and Scotland was no better.
Well, I would challenge that. I think at the start that Scotland followed a similar trajectory because there was only the source of advice was SAGE. It was a reserved power. It was not devolved. And very early on, after the lockdown, end of March, early April, First Minister Nicola Sturgeon set up her own advisory group with transparency, with minutes published, with membership published to advise her. And actually, if you look at that point, there was divergence in terms of our case numbers and in terms of our death numbers. But the problem is we are all one country, so we don't have control in Scotland over borders. So stopping, let's say, flights coming in, screening, and also financial power to actually be able to support different kinds of restrictions and interventions when they're needed. And so I would say, you know, obviously we've done the best we can in Scotland and there's a lot of mistakes that have been made, but actually we were actually having our hands tied as well along the way.
And do you think Cummings was better than perhaps you thought?
I found him actually quite honest because it followed a lot of what I think Richard and I were hearing from colleagues and from journalists about what happened. So it mapped and validated a lot of what we assumed had happened. I think he acknowledged his role in it as well, to a certain extent, that maybe he could have been more forceful. But I think, you know, he did acknowledge the mistakes that were made. And I think it's the first time we've heard it. And it's part of the process of healing and moving forward. We must move forward as a country. And if you look at the parts of the world that did well, they learned. West Africa learned from Ebola. South Korea bungled MERS, but they got it right this time. Taiwan was scared by SARS, so they got it right this time. And that's what our challenge is, which is to say, let's look back not with anger, let's look back with actually, forensically, of what do we need to change in our system so it functions better next time. So we do not have multiple lockdowns, we do not have an overburdened NHS, and we actually come out of this effectively with not, a lot of people dying who don't need to.
Devi Sridhar and Richard Horton, thank you both very much indeed. Thank you. Policy made up on the hoof, ministers lying to their colleagues, a prime minister unwilling to believe his own officials, scientists using faulty data. The list of allegations made by former number 10 advisor Dominic Cummings today is long, but is it shocking? I'm joined by Jill Rutter, who worked as a civil servant for more than 2 decades at the Treasury and in Downing Street, and is now a senior fellow at the Institute of Government. Also with me is broadcast editor at The Spectator, Cindy Yu. Jill Rutter, is it always this terrible in Downing Street?
Well, this was an unparalleled crisis, I think, and a very inexperienced government. It's always a bit chaotic. There was a moment when they were talking about number 10 having to compete with the pandemic, President Trump wanting to bomb the Middle East, and the Prime Minister's dog problems and Carrie sounding off about that. So, and that did sound like a bit extreme, but a not untypical day at number 10. But I think, this was an unparalleled thing. And you have to remember that. But I think it was also a very inexperienced team. It hadn't worked out how to function. But what was really, I think, most notable from all of Dominic Cummings' testimony today was just the absence of any other minister. Clearly a complete breakdown of trust between at least Dominic Cummings and Matt Hancock, if not between the Prime Minister and Matt Hancock, the Health Secretary. But the Prime Minister seemed not to have any ministerial colleagues.
There was no mention of Michael Gove or anything like that, really? I mean, you thought he was more involved in these things at that stage?
I think most people assume Michael Gove, probably including Michael Gove, thought he was more involved. The Chancellor was very much a walk-on player, just following the strategy set by the Prime Minister, not having any real say in it.
So you're sceptical of how accurate this was?
I'm not sure. I mean, I think it was obviously one account, and as the Queen might say, recollections may vary. So I'm not sure it's totally accurate, but I think the sense the Prime Minister is a loner and actually doesn't pay much attention to most of his cabinet members probably rings very true.
Cindy Yu, I mean, if half of this is true, it's pretty appalling, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. But when you actually look at it, 7 hours, I don't know about Jill, but I found myself having a tough time peeling myself away from it. But when you actually look at the new claims, the things that we didn't know before, they're actually few and far between. There was a claim that Matt Hancock lied to the Prime Minister and to Dominic Cummings about whether or not to test the elderly before sending them back into care homes. There were claims about general incompetence, about a lack of preparedness, about the plan for pandemics not really coming to fruition, that there was no such thing as furlough, he said, until Rishi Sunak and his team literally developed it overnight. So a lot of this stuff, I think the British public does know. And I think if I were in number 10 tonight, it is a flustering time. But with the success of the vaccine programme, Boris Johnson is somewhat protected, because a lot of the the back and forth and disorganisation has been on show.
Yeah, no, I mean, how people react, I mean, well, time will tell, and so far they haven't blamed the government in elections or polls, but we do like to think of ourselves as competent, as a country with a history of government, and this looked pretty incompetent, didn't it?
Yes, that's true, but I have to say, it wasn't Dominic Cummings' hearing that, would have told people that we were not very good at dealing with this pandemic. I'm Chinese myself. I've looked all throughout the pandemic at the way that Asia has tackled it, and it's such a cliche to say now, but a lot of Asian countries, not just China, but Taiwan, Singapore, Japan, South Korea, have all dealt with it better. And, to some extent, that's an institutional problem. As Dominic Cummings said, a lot of people in the government did not think that we could do things in the same way that Asia was doing them, but now we know. And Asia had its 2003 SARS pandemic, so it did have some pre-warning about what this could look like. So I think we will get better the next time round. What is concerning, though, is Dominic Cummings is saying that the plans for solar flares, for cybersecurity, all these other things that might come up were not very good either. So I think what we need to take away from this is actually to review all these sort of black swan events. They're very rare to happen, but when they do happen, are we prepared enough?
He also, Jill Rutter, said, if they were lying about all of these things, what else are they lying about? Which a lot of people will also wonder, won't they?
Yes, and we'll have to see whether he makes those claims stand up, because obviously Matt Hancock is going to answer them, and Matt Hancock's appearing before the same select committee in a couple of weeks' time, so we'll have to see whether he thinks that stacks up. I mean, there's some things that clearly have got better. The data was clearly a very big problem, but they seem to have built a much better data system. I think one of the things that was surprising was the way in which they sort of, in a sense, didn't use February to stress test the Department of Health and Social Care pandemic plan. I think it was very striking when Dominic Cummings recounted that meeting on the 13th of March when Senior Cabinet Office official Helen McNamara walks in and says, you know, the plan doesn't work, we're going to kill thousands of people. Because you'd have thought that you could have used that time to do that.
But it's the one-man plan, you know, the way Dominic Cummings portrayed himself as having saved the day all by himself with his whiteboard, with no data from anywhere else in government. Is that plausible? I mean, what does the rest of the government do?
Well, I think you've undoubtedly got lots of people feeding in different advice. The problem is that that advice gets very filtered into the Prime Minister, and this is clearly not a Prime Minister who is sitting around kicking ideas around with a lot of senior and experienced colleagues. He was overly dependent on one person, or maybe one or two people, but he seems to be even more overly dependent on his own instincts, and I think that's really what Dominic Cummings' big criticism of.
Cindy, just very briefly at the end, I mean, what about all the stuff heard at Boris Johnson? Does any of it matter about his finances, his girlfriend, his dog? Do you think people care?
Yeah, I'm not sure, to be honest. I think, you know, the first 3 hearings were on the first lockdown, and I think the public are very forgiving, or relatively forgiving, when it comes to, you know, the first time you deal with a pandemic, you don't realise what it's going to be and a mistake that you make. But this last hearing was about the second lockdown, and Dominic Cummings said that Boris Johnson even there hesitated. And so that's the sort of stuff that could really stick, because you've done it once, and why are you hesitating the second time? What was also damaging was, I thought...
I'm sorry, Cindy, we're out of time, but thank you very much indeed for joining us, and Jill Rutter, thank you.
Dominic Cummings, the PM's former aide, came to Westminster today for the political equivalent of a drive-by shooting which savaged numerous reputations, including arguably his own. He accepted blame for the failures in dealing with coronavirus and did sound genuinely sorry and shocked at what had happened. His assertion that people like him and Boris Johnson shouldn't have been running the country in the first place might have tested people's patience, since he arguably did more to put him there than anyone else, but many of his other blows landed with considerable force. He said many times that the Health Secretary had lied repeatedly and should have been sacked. He said his own boss, the Prime Minister, acted too slowly and thought COVID was a scare story, and that tens of thousands had therefore died unnecessarily. And he accused the Prime Minister's fiancée, Carrie Symonds, of distracting Mr Johnson and the government on a critical day over a newspaper report about their dog. Yes, even old Dylan the dog did not escape Mr Cummings' revenge or determination to set the record straight, depending on your point of view.
If you were under the impression that Dominic Cummings had already spilled all the beans on his time in government, then over the course of 7 hours of detailed evidence to MPs, the Prime Minister's former chief aide was out to prove that very wrong. Sounding uncharacteristically nervous, he started, perhaps wisely, with an apology.
The truth is that senior ministers, senior officials, senior advisors like me fell disastrously short of the standards that the public has a right to expect of its government in a crisis like this. When the public needed us most, the government failed. And I'd like to say to all the families of those who died unnecessarily, how sorry I am for the mistakes that were made and for my own mistakes at that.
Downing Street claimed the Prime Minister wasn't watching. If he had, he would have heard his government painted as woefully underprepared for a pandemic that he himself failed to take seriously.
In February, the Prime Minister regarded this as just a scare story. He described it as the new swine flu.
Did you tell him it wasn't?
Certainly. But the view of various officials inside Number 10 was, if we have the Prime Minister chairing Cobra meetings and he just tells everyone it's swine flu, don't worry about it, I'm going to get Chris Whitty to inject me live on TV with coronavirus so everyone realises it's nothing to be frightened of, that would not help.
Mr Cummings portrayed himself as almost a lone voice urging a change of tack in mid-March, while Number 10 was in chaos over the Middle East and the Prime Minister's partner's dog.
So we had this sort of completely insane situation in which part of the building was saying, are we going to bomb Iraq? Part of the building was arguing about whether or not we're going to do quarantine or not do quarantine. The Prime Minister has his girlfriend going crackers about something completely trivial.
The Health Secretary too might have looked rather less cheerful about his morning run if he'd known what was coming.
Are you worried about Dominic Cummings giving evidence today, Mr Hancock?
I think that the Secretary of State for Health should have been fired for at least 15, 20 things, including lying to everybody in multiple occasions, in meeting after meeting in the Cabinet room and publicly. I said repeatedly to the Prime Minister that he should be fired. So did the Cabinet Secretary, so did many other senior people.
As for one of the gravest mistakes of the pandemic, the release of hospital patients into care homes without testing, that too he laid at Matt Hancock's door.
Hancock told us in the Cabinet room that people were going to be tested before they went back to care homes. What the hell happened? Now, all the government rhetoric was we put a shield around care homes and blah, blah, blah. It was complete nonsense. Quite the opposite of putting a shield around them, we sent people with COVID back to the care homes.
In response, the Health Secretary claimed his attention today was focused firmly on anything but Cummings.
Well, I haven't seen this performance today in full, and instead I've been dealing with getting the vaccination rollout going, especially to over 30s, and saving lives. I'll be giving a statement in the House of Commons tomorrow, and I'll have more to say then.
Matt Hancock might now regret his supportive tweet for Dominic Cummings when he broke lockdown rules by fleeing to Barnard Castle. On that, Mr Cummings had a new explanation. He'd gone because he feared for his family's security.
So before the whole thing happened with the Prime Minister being sick, my wife calling up on the Friday and everything else, it had already been decided that I was going to move my family out of London, regardless of the COVID rules.
Leaving that information out, he now says, was a mistake.
Just the whole thing was a complete disaster. And the truth is, and that it undermined public confidence in the whole thing.
On the man who he helped into Number 10, Cummings now claims Boris Johnson was not fit to be Prime Minister and crucially failed to take scientific advice to lock down earlier in the autumn.
I regarded him as unfit for the job, and I was trying to create a structure around him to try and stop what I thought were extremely bad decisions and push other things through against his wishes.
And he contradicted the Prime Minister's denial that he ever said this.
Did you hear him say, let the bodies pile high in their thousands?
I heard that in the Prime Minister's study.
Midway through his former aide's evidence, Boris Johnson had to mount his defence at Prime Minister's questions.
None of the decisions have been easy. To go into a lockdown is a traumatic thing for a country. To deal with a pandemic on this scale has been appallingly difficult, and we've at every stage tried to minimise loss of life, to save lives, to protect the NHS.
But in all the reams of evidence, the hardest thing for the Prime Minister to bat away will be this central damaging claim.
Tens of thousands of people died who didn't need to die.
The advisor turned assassin finally left the building, his evidence leading to immediate calls to bring forward the public inquiry. It's not hard to see why the Prime Minister might be less keen to do that. Romilly Weeks, News at 10.
Well, as we just heard from Romilly, Mr Cummings rubbished those claims by Matt Hancock that care homes were shielded as the pandemic began. Complete nonsense and lies, he called them. Mr Cummings said that when the Prime Minister returned to work after having a serious case of the virus himself, he was furious to learn untested patients had been sent to care homes in England. The Prime Minister asked what on earth happened, only rather less politely. Care home staff and thousands of grieving families believe they know the answer to that one.
From the start, we've worked incredibly hard to throw that protective ring around our care homes.
That rhetoric never seemed to match this reality.
Do you feel like you're getting any support?
From the government and public health, no, absolutely not.
And today, one of those at the heart of government finally admitted as much.
Quite the opposite of putting a shield around them, we sent people with COVID back to the care homes.
Several of them arrived here.
This floor, Paul, was the floor that we actually used
for patients that did have COVID.
In May last year, Debbie showed us how she believed a COVID outbreak at her care home could be traced back to a hospital patient whose COVID status hadn't been disclosed.
It's completely blank.
Yeah.
For her, today's evidence finally fills in the details.
We did know. We knew that they were sending them back to care homes without being tested. You know, I knew it'd come out in the end, the truth would come out.
Matt Hancock is your Secretary of State, he's in charge of care homes. Do you have any confidence in him now?
I didn't back then, and I've got none at the moment at all, and I won't have. He should resign. There's a lot of lives been lost, Paul, a lot of lives, and it could have been stopped.
This isn't right, Paul.
Last year, the Health Secretary insisted to me that things weren't that simple.
And the question is why you didn't test them. It does come back to why you didn't test these patients leaving hospital.
The truth is that around the world, people didn't know that there was the asymptomatic transmission.
But tomorrow, he'll have to provide a fuller answer in the Commons.
These are deeply shocking accusations, and anyone who has lost a loved one in this awful crisis will expect Matt Hancock to explain whether Dominic Cummings is correct or whether he's correct.
That includes the family of Femi Akinola, who worked in social care.
He was the person I checked in with all the time, and now there's just, I can't describe how complete and how deafening the silence is.
And I'd like to say to all the families of those who died unnecessarily, how sorry I am for the mistakes that were made and for my own mistakes of that.
All of today's noise does not fill that void.
Listening to it, I definitely I felt viscerally ill, because I was just like sad, so sad, because I didn't have to be here. I didn't have to be here. I don't have to be having this conversation, if only some people thought, hang on, this is serious and we need to do something.
For all the pressure on those in power, for families like Femi's, the pandemic has already cost so much more than careers. Paul Brand, News at 10.
And let's go and talk to Robert, who is, of course, recording his programme. Always worth watching tonight, I would say, particularly so. Robert, I'm not sure I've ever seen an attack on anyone's reputation like the one on Matt Hancock today, and the PM only really got off lightly by comparison. He still took some very heavy hits. What do you make of it all?
So look, first of all, like you, I've never seen anything quite like this. Let's be under no illusion. Dominic Cummings, from the middle of 2009 till the time that he quit at the end of 2020, the second most powerful person in the government after Boris Johnson. And he's turned on Boris Johnson and the government and has, among other things, alleged that his boss, Boris Johnson, is incompetent. The serious charges that have to now be examined are, one, that there was incompetence from the start by scientists, by officials, by politicians, even by Dominic Cummings himself in February and March, in not recognising the gravity of this crisis, and indeed only going towards a policy of suppression and lockdown when it became clear that the policy that would see a big surge in the spring would lead to perhaps 500,000 deaths. Second charge, you've just heard from Romilly about Matt Hancock, that Matt Hancock simply didn't do enough when it came to getting protective equipment, when it came to protecting vulnerable people in care homes, but misled people right at the top of the government about what he was doing. And I think arguably the strongest charge of all, that scientists, Dominic Cummings, were telling the Prime Minister in September to lock down, and the Prime Minister's refusal to lock down led to tens of thousands of avoidable deaths. Now, the government's policy appears to be, at this stage, not really to attack Dominic Cummings. Interesting, I've just had Robert Jenrick, one of the members of the Cabinet, on the show. He refused to attack Dominic Cummings. They're all basically saying this is for the inquiry next year, when I think Boris Johnson hopes that we'll all be bored with it and it won't sort of damage him quite as much. But I don't think this stuff is going away. John Edmonds, senior scientist on Sage, corroborates on my show tonight Dominic Cummings' view that failure to lock down in September may well have cost tens of thousands of lives. I would say that it's an unmissable interview which people should watch.